Hey, good morning, everyone. I want to do a summary review of Chapter 6, which is, I believe, entitled A New Nation. It's a fantastic chapter, has a lot of material. It covers a very important part of our history. It actually covers the formation of our United States Constitution as we now know it, at least in terms of structure. Obviously, it's changed over time, and some of the interpretation of the Constitution has changed. But we actually break away from our original framework of governance. And that's one thing I have to criticize the book a little bit about. It seems like it all of a sudden just jumps right in and saying, hey, uh, we had this thing called the Articles of Confederation, didn't work, so we had to send basically leaders of different now called states to come to a convention and fix the Articles of Confederation. I think it's important to study a little bit the Articles of Confederation, a little deeper than I think the text did, to find out what its problems were. Remember, when we broke away from Great Britain, we were 13 independent colonies, but we decided to become a confederation. And if you read the Articles of Confederation, it's actually called a League of Friendship. Sounds like something the superheroes would have on a Saturday morning cartoon show that I used to watch as a kid. But it was a League of Friendship, 13 independent colonies. And because of that, it created a lot of challenges. And in and of itself, any kind of confederation is, by its very nature, weak in its central authority. And we were rebelling against centralized power, right? We wanted to have power locally. And so states were pretty happy. And initially, it wasn't terrible. It lasted roughly 8 years, 1781 to 1787. The Articles of Confederation were just that, a league of friendship, loosely confederated with very little power in the central government. How little of a power? Almost token. You, in theory, it gave us the ability to be recognized by foreign nations as a nation, and therefore we could get financial support and aid and treaty with foreign nations, things like that. But the difficulty was we couldn't regulate interstate or international trade tariffs in a unified fashion. It was a very cumbersome form of government with very little authority, couldn't raise taxes, couldn't regulate interstate commerce between two or more states, and it couldn't regulate tariff protocols with foreign nations. It was very, very difficult. The most important flaw within it, I think the most important, couldn't raise money. If you don't have any money, what can you do? You can't raise a military. You have to ask for volunteers to come from the different colonies. And it's just that, volunteers. And it's like anything else. It sounds great on paper until you actually have to put, when the rubber hits the road, so to speak. The colonies weren't willing to give up financial resources sort of as a voluntary tax when their own state economies were suffering in this period. And we were. It was a very, very financially strife time in the colonies. Different colonies were charging other colonies taxes on imports and exports. Some colonies were so close to actually coming to armed conflicts with other states that it was remarkable that we didn't really break down or become conquered by a foreign entity, because we were very, very weak militarily, financially, and in terms of organization during this period of time. The other great problem with the Articles of Confederation is, in order to amend it, if we saw a problem, like we need to be able to raise some taxes, we need to be able to regulate commerce. The two biggest problems, I think, within the document or within the governance body was that it needed uniform consent. Anytime you're establishing a club or an organization or any kind of entity. So one thing I always shy away from, I'm on subcommittees sometimes at the college or at other places that I'm involved in, and somebody says, well, what do we need? What should we have for a vote for something being passed or changed or something like that? And somebody goes, well, it should be unanimous because this is very important. And I'm always the one saying, oh boy, based upon history, I don't think we should ever have much be anything unanimous other than determining someone's guilt or lack of guilt in a criminal trial, because that's about taking away somebody's liberty. So that's the problem. We couldn't amend this document very easily, and many of the votes to just do traditional action under the Articles of Confederation took a supermajority of 9 of the 13 states. Very, very difficult to get things done. And again, there's no enforcement mechanism. It was a weak document, and many people think it was just awful. Well, it created a nation. It also allowed us to work with foreign nations in terms of aid and cooperation and treaties, but it was anemic internally, and it really was a big problem. And the book starts off with Shays' Rebellion, which is a great example right in Western Mass. They're mostly Western Mass farmers. They're very heavily indebted after the Revolutionary War. Creditors are starting to basically foreclose on their farms, take them to try to put them in debtors' prisons. We used to have those back in the day. And these farmers, many of them served in the Revolutionary War, and say, wait a minute, state government, come to our aid. You got to do some kind of reform so we don't lose our farms. You need to help us financially in some way. You have to stop these creditors from doing it. Well, Boston really sided with the creditors for the most part. So the Western Mass farmers took up arms. At one point, I think there were several thousand of them, and they nearly took over the Springfield Armory, right where Springfield Technical Community College is housed at this time. That's where I went to community college. And it was so unsettling to the forefathers during this era. We won the revolution from Great Britain, and now Massachusetts is an open revolt. Our state's falling apart. And what did the state government do? Governor Bowdoin said, "Hey, federal government, come in and send some. We don't have federal troops to send in. We don't have federal money. We don't have anything. We can't. You do it yourself." And although in the book it suggests that Bowdoin brings up the state militia, what he actually did was hire private mercenaries, really, to go down and suppress Shays' Rebellion. And what Shays' Rebellion was doing was not only rebelling against the government's inaction to protect its citizens in their view, but they were also surrounding all the different courthouses so they couldn't foreclose on the property. They were taking like direct action, and then they went after the armory to seek more armament. I think all of them managed to escape being executed, after being charged and things like that. Some of them remain heroes. I know Daniel Shays for a period of time. I think he went up to Vermont and exiled for a period of time and became a farmer. Most of them were pardoned by George Washington later on as a recognition that you got to put an olive branch out there sometimes, because their spark, Shays' Rebellion, had a certain degree of legitimacy. They were using the same arguments that the revolutionary members of the colonies were using against Great Britain. No, we're not being represented appropriately. We don't have a government that's responsive to the people's needs. So Shays' Rebellion is a catalyst. What are the other catalysts? The fact that each state is producing its own currency. Some currency has some value. Some's backed up by what we call species or precious metals. Others aren't. I don't know if it's Rhode Island. I think it was Rhode Island. I always think of Rhode Island. I like to pick on Rhode Island. They were just printing money like, on a printing press, and its devaluation was incredible. Big time of instability. So the framers said we have to do something. And the book doesn't even mention this, at least I didn't see it. Initially, James Madison, Hamilton, and a few others, 5 states in all, went down to Annapolis for the first the first constitutional convention, and 5 states show up. They're saying, hey, it's not going to happen, but some big guns are there, guys like Madison and Hamilton, and a few others. And they said, but they recognize the need. Well, we're not going to change it with just 5 states down here. Let's do it again. Let's really publicize it. Let's get the leaders down to, now this time, Philadelphia. Annapolis is in Maryland, but not too far from there is Philadelphia. So they go to Philadelphia. They invite all the colonies to come down, not to overthrow the Articles of Confederation, but to modify it, to make some recommendations to the states to come up with a new set of amendments to fix it. Everybody comes except one state, it's Rhode Island. Rhode Island decides not to come. They're too busy. So the other 12 states are there. They come down. Some send several representatives. In fact, Massachusetts comes down with some representatives from Maine as well, too. Maine's not a state, but Massachusetts owned Maine at this time, and we wanted some reps to come down with us. But each state would get one vote, no matter how many reps you sent down. I think there was something like 55, 60 delegates that came down to the Constitutional Convention to amend or make recommendations to fix the Articles of Confederation. And what happens very early on, they recognize that it's not fixable. It's just too fundamentally flawed. And one guy comes with a plan, and that's James Madison. We'll get to that in a second. But prior to that, and I hate to say it, this book does it too. Almost every book I read does it. But if you really analyze it, they make it sound like the framers all went out there with a blank slate of what government really should be, that we should have a legislature that's bicameral, we should have an executive with certain powers, and we should have a judiciary that has a certain role, and they should have certain independence from one another. They should be able to act as checks and balances against each other. It makes it sound like these guys down in 1787, they go down to Philadelphia, and no one's ever heard of that or done anything like it. It's going to be such a unique process. That's a falsehood. They actually had examples from state governments that were arguably working fairly well, and other governments throughout the history of the world and philosophies. And James Madison was a student of that. So were others too. And if you look at the federal Constitution in terms of its structure and in terms of its language, boy, it's pretty darn close to the Massachusetts Constitution, which is roughly 10 years. It's junior. It came out 10 years earlier. So to make it sound like they had no idea what to possibly come up with, and they all drafted it during these several months down in Philadelphia, I think it's a bit of a stretch. But anyways, Madison had it all written out. Madison's a really good tactician. He's kind of a meek character. He doesn't have a strong personality on its surface. So he's not getting a lot of attention until things start falling apart. And he comes out with a written plan. I always recommend that some of you might want to become lawyers or anything you do in life. If you come with something in writing, it's easier to work off that document than someone who doesn't have a document at all, even if it isn't necessarily what you want in its entirety. But by working off the framework you propose, I think you're often at an advantage. That's what James Madison did. And what's his plan for test purposes? It's the Virginia plan. Now, instead of having a very weak central government, he wants a very strong central government. The key arm of it, if you will be the legislature. In his proposal, there would be a Senate and a House of Representatives, but both of the branches of the legislature would be based upon the representation of their population. So right away, states like Virginia, where Madison's from, New York, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, the big four, they're very happy. Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey, New Hampshire, they are in some of the southern states that are smaller. They're like, no way. We're not going to give up all of our power to populous states, because if the central government is going to be powerful and it's going to be based upon representation of the population, we're going to get screwed. And so there needed to be a compromise. Somebody comes up, and they always like to talk about history books. I'm kind of pleased in a way your history book doesn't, because it's kind of like, well, it's sort of a Trivial Pursuit question. It's not that important because no one took it too seriously. And that was simply the New Jersey plan. I guess you should know about it. The New Jersey plan was saying, hey, we're not here to overthrow the Articles of Confederation. We're here to fix it. Let's just take that supermajority, that, I say unanimity that was required, all 13 colonies, reduce it down to maybe 10 or 9 for changing and amending the document itself. And the other thing we should do is give it the power to regulate commerce and the power to tax. Those are the two big things it was missing. And I have to admit, in hindsight, it's not necessarily the worst idea, but most people these guys that were down there in Philadelphia said, we got to throw this thing out. It's too weak in too many fashions. So the New Jersey plan didn't go anywhere. The Virginia plan, with an executive, a legislature, a judiciary, it's sound to most people with one major problem. States that are larger in population are going to get all the authority. You're going to lose the smaller states. You're not going to agree to this document. So we needed some kind of compromise. And that it has a couple different names. One of them is called the U.S. Constitution, because that's ultimately what we adopt. The other is called the Connecticut Compromise. And the reason why is one of the reps there, a guy named Roger Sherman, so it's also called Sherman's Compromise, says, here's how we're going to fix this. We'll have a bicameral legislature. In the bicameral legislature, the Senate will be equally represented based upon statehood. So if you're a state, you're going to get 2 U.S. senators no matter what. That made the small states very happy. Kind of makes the large states kind of disgruntled, because shouldn't we have more representation if we're just simply bigger in terms of population? Aren't we supposed to be representative of the people? People are getting a lot less representation from populated states if you just do it the Senate. And that's where the lower house comes in. The lower house would be called the House of Representatives, and they would be made up of numerically based upon population of your state. So the more populated the state, the more members of the House of Representatives you'd have. And what surprises a lot of people is they weren't in for pure democracy. They wanted a Republican form of democracy with certain gateways to avoid mob rule. Pure democracy can be very, very much the tyranny of the popular. And so they wanted to create certain kinds of protections against that. And one of them was that the Senate would not be elected directly by the people. It would be indirectly elected. What do I mean by that? The people would rest their judgment on their state legislatures. So up until 1913, our U.S. senators from each state, 2 from each state, would be selected by your state governments. Your state legislatures would pick them. Some people, there was recently I don't know if he's just trying to grandstand, get some news, but about a month ago, I remember reading the headlines in my newsfeed that some senator said we need to repeal, I think it's the 17th Amendment, to take away the U.S. senators a popular election, because it's too damning. We need more professional technocrats, if you will, to be in government, and the popular election is too much pandering to popularity, and that's not appropriate. I'm more of a Jeffersonian viewpoint. I think the people should decide more directly, but the more directly you get, now my 20-year-old who's sleeping downstairs just below me right now has just as much power to vote as I do. And I don't know if that's always necessarily the healthiest thing to create stability and responsibility in government. But anyways, the other was, what are we going to do for the executive? One thing that the Virginia plan had that our current constitution or the Sherman plan doesn't have, the Virginia plan was going to allow the federal government to veto state laws, just outright. If they didn't like a state law, they could veto it, not because it was unconstitutional, not because it conflicted with a federal law, just simply they didn't like it. They could have the power to veto state law. They took that out. There are many people that were very concerned about giving up the sovereignty of the locality of your state. They wanted to retain state powers. So that's the second part that the book doesn't talk too much about. We're going to grant the federal government only certain enumerated powers. You're not supposed to go outside this list of powers we grant the federal government. It's a government of limited authority. What power we don't give to the federal government is reserved to whom? The people in the states. That's the other checks and balances in our governmental system, not just between the three branches, but between the federal government and the state government. There's a check between the two. Some have authority in some questions or issues have authority in the federal government. Some simply don't. The federal government just simply can't touch it. They don't have authority to do so. So that's in most framers, if you go through history, everyone says we have three co-equal branches of government. That was never the intent. The intent was to make the legislature, which is the most democratic branch of government, to be the most powerful. There was no question. It creates law. Now, for some reason, we call it three co-equal branches of government. We should say three co-equal in their sphere of jurisdiction. In that sense, they do. I mean, the legislature is omnipotent in creating law. The executive is omnipotent in enforcing law and being the realm that the president has, being commander in chief and to be the chief negotiator of foreign affairs. Those things that are listed in the powers of the executive. So the big debate coming out of there again, the big compromise, the great compromise is about the legislature and how it'll be made up based upon one part of the bicameral body being population, House of Representatives, the others by pure statehood, that's the Senate. That's called the Great Compromise. There's many other compromises. How much power are we going to give the federal government? How much is going to be retained by the state? Who could vote? All these, that was going to be reserved to the states to determine who can vote, and it still is to this day, to some level, is determined by state rules on eligibility to vote. And then they go to the executive. And another check on pure democracy is we don't have popular elections for the president. That seems to stymie a lot of people, and a lot of people are mystified by it, including myself, even though I study it quite a bit. We have something called the Electoral College. That's where your vote is filtered through a process to ensure certain regions of the country don't dominate. Usually the coast, well, back then it was just the East Coast. We didn't get the West Coast until much later. But now when you look at it, do we really want just the coastal parts of the United States to have the greatest influence? Because that's where the greatest population is. If it goes just to one vote, one person, it's mostly the urban centers that would basically dictate who our president was. So they saw this thing called the Electoral College as a filter for that. It would actually arguably weaken somewhat the most congregated, populated areas in the urban centers, and it would bolden or strengthen some of the more rural or agrarian areas of our nation in terms of the individual votes. And then once you voted, delegates would be selected by the party. Well, it wasn't then the party, but it would be by state leadership, and they would go down. And then there's still an argument today: did they have to vote for whom the population of your state voted for? So if Massachusetts supported Hillary Clinton, could the delegates that, I think we have 13 or 14, whatever it is, electoral college votes, do they have to be locked in? It would seem that it would make sense that they have to be locked in. Otherwise, the popular vote would be completely ignored. But there's some Supreme Court cases that say that the delegates do have the power to exercise discretion potentially under some states' rules. So that's still up in the air, and there's a lot of debate. It still goes on to this day. Should we get rid of the electoral college system that a lot of people are baffled by, and it's a bit mysterious? Who are these delegates? Who get sent down there? And do they have to be locked into what your state actually chose by popular vote? Or can they have discretion and move out of it? People say this is a Byzantine, archaic system. It should be about democracy. One vote, one person, and they want to change that system. Now, two people that lost. Hillary Clinton's been a bit quiet about whether or not she wants to repeal the Electoral College vote. There's no question she won the popular vote. And if that were the system we have, she would have been the president of the United States at this juncture. Same with Al Gore. he won the popular vote but lost the Electoral College. Al Gore has publicly spoken on this issue quite a bit, and he's always said he wants to keep the Electoral College vote. It's the system that we have. It's a filter upon which pure mob rule and democracy actually would rest, and he had no qualms about it. He had a qualm about it in the sense that he lost and wish he hadn't because he really wanted to become president, but he didn't want to change the system as a result of his Electoral College loss. And sometimes it's kind of interesting if you look at the Electoral College. Donald Trump definitely won the Electoral College. People debate with me all this time and say, "Oh, Hillary Clinton got, won the election. She got robbed." No, she won the popular vote. There's no question. But if you look at the Electoral College number, Donald Trump actually had a fairly convincing win because it's not directly related to popular vote. And there's been a few others, and we're going to talk about one of them in our first real election in the United States because there's a tie for first place in the Electoral College vote between members of the same political. Both of them, what we call well, actually, one's a Federalist, but we'll get to that in a second. Everything's changed so much in terms of political parties and everything else. So they go down and then they create the third branch, which is going to become the judiciary. Now, careful. At this juncture, the judiciary does not have what we think of as its check and balance within the government. It doesn't have the ability anywhere in the written part of the document, nor was it ever debated, that they would be able to, a court, especially the Supreme Court, review a federal statute or a federal act of the president or a state law and strike it down as being contradictory to the United States Constitution's mandates or parameters. We all believe that today. In fact, if you're watching the current nomination process of the Supreme Court justice, that's one of the questions they asked her. What's this concept of a super president mean? Once an established rule has been established by a court, is it very, very unlikely to ever be overturned? And the one she kept citing was a famous case, which is in this book, and we'll get to a little bit, Marbury versus Madison, where the Supreme Court basically just seized that power by saying, being the branch of government that's designed to interpret law, the Constitution of the United States is a form of law, and therefore we're the final arbiter of what it means, and we have the ability to strike down any law that's contrary to the supreme law of the land. That's called the power of judicial review. It's huge. Very significant. Now we have those checks and balances, but it didn't come out in the original document, and I don't know if the framers really intended that to happen, but the Supreme Court Justice John Marshall, who was at the convention, by the way, and was one of our early framers of the document itself, really seizes the power for the court to do the thing called judicial review, which gives it that, I don't want to call it equanimity, but it gives it that sense that it has a significance equal in some sense to the judiciary and to the executive in terms of its power. So it passes, right? And a lot of storytellers say that's it. They go to the Constitutional Convention, they get this new Constitution, and everyone celebrates. And then some people just say in cursory form, it's sent out to the states and the states voted up. This book does that a little bit too. What they recognized was, what does the preamble to the United States Constitution say? We, the people. In order to ordain a more perfect union, we the people. The power doesn't come from a king. It doesn't come from the government. It comes from the people. So to really buy into that, I got to give these guys credit. They were really smart in this regard. They sent it back to the states, not to have the state legislatures vote on whether they want to approve the new constitutional concept, but they sent it back to the states to form special state constitutional convention votings based upon its citizens, based upon eligible voters. They would make up basically a approval or disapproval committee, and they would vote within each state, not the state legislatures. And why did they do that? Because the state legislatures were basically voting on giving up a lot of their state authority, because up until then, the states were almost independent nations. And now they're saying, we want to give away some of your power to a centralized authority, thereby weakening your position as a state legislator. Very smart, giving it to these state conventions to determine approval or rejection. It goes through a couple of the southern states and smaller states pretty quickly, passes easily. The first real test is Massachusetts. And boy, if you really study the history of the approval process of the United States Constitution, they were sweating it in Massachusetts. They thought there was two groups. One were the Federalists, who wanted a strong central government and wanted to have a sense of one nation as opposed to 13. And then there were the anti-federalists to say, hey, we're giving up way too much power to a centralized government over a vast land. And it's just going to be like back going Great Britain. They're going to be ruling this out of Philadelphia, which was the capital then, but later Washington, D.C. We're not going to have any home rule. We're going to give up our autonomy, where there's going to be tyranny. There's going to be a tyranny from this new central government. And what's the one thing the constitutional proposal didn't come out with? I was going to say Ten Commandments, the Bill of Rights, because a lot of people say, hey, we got this document here. It's going to give the federal government all kinds of power. But what about making sure our civil liberties are protected? The Federalists, those in favor of adopting the Constitution, says, well, it's not really needed. It's a government of limited authority. These are unlikely to prevail against and injure individuals' civil liberties. It's just not needed. And the anti-federalists who didn't want this new powerful centralized government were very fearful of too strong of federal authority. They really pushed back, and what really was Sam Adams here in Massachusetts was initially an anti-federalist, didn't think passage of the Constitution was appropriate, no Bill of Rights, too strong a federal government. The proponents of it wrote articles to propagandize the adoption or the rejection of it. The anti-federalists tend to be more farmers, artisans, middling class. The Federalists tend to be wealthy, aristocratic, and heavily educated, very, very wealthy people. And they had a much better propaganda machine. And what was their propaganda called? The Federalist Papers. They went out, mostly Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison. They wrote these beautiful articles under fictitious, Greek philosopher names. And they wrote these articles, mostly in New York newspapers, but they got disseminated throughout the colonies, pushing for why the need for the Constitution to be adopted. And that helped propel the Constitution's ultimate approval in each of the colonies. But Massachusetts, like I said, it was right on the fence. It came down to within, I think, a handful of votes. What changed it? The Federalists said, I know there's no Bill of Rights. We don't think it's really needed, but we promise the very first act of the first Congress under the new Constitution will be to pass a Bill of Rights. We promise you that. And people bought into the promise because these people were statesmen. They were fiduciaries. They usually held pretty close to what they promised people in political bargains. And that promise probably turned the tide of Massachusetts. Other people say, well, it was Virginia that was the linchpin, but Virginia was washing Massachusetts. Virginia came in within 10 votes out of hundreds of votes. Hundreds of citizens would vote for these constitution conventions. It was that tight a race in these key states. After Virginia, New York followed. We needed everyone to sign on, though. We really did. We didn't want like a major state like a Virginia, a Pennsylvania, a New York, or a Massachusetts to reject it. If it did, it probably wouldn't have that sort of buy-in, that social contract that we wanted. I think Massachusetts still was the linchpin. If you read a lot of the history about the adoption of the Constitution, it was Massachusetts was the turning point. Then it ultimately went to all the other states, and eventually all 13 states signed on. I think New Hampshire took a couple of bites. They objected initially, came back later. But the last state, Rhode Island again. Rhode Island actually didn't sign on to the new Constitution until George Washington already had become president. I always find that interesting about our good friends in Rhode Island. So things are going pretty swimmingly now after we adopt the Constitution, but you should still know about, besides the Great Compromise, you should know about other compromises between how much power the federal government given and whether the president would, serve for life, for good conduct, or should it be a term of years? What would be the eligibility? And that's all written in the Constitution. Many compromises in terms of age: 25 to be a U.S. House of Representative member, 30 to be a United States Senator. We know you have to be 35 to be a United States President. Those things are thought about, maturity for the office. And you think, well, that's pretty damn young. Well, back in 1789 or 1787, when it's ultimately proposed for adoption, that's considered to be a ripe old person at the time. But other compromises you should know about, which I kind of skipped over, two involve slavery. One is southern states are saying, boy, the House of Representatives, that's going to be a very powerful branch in the legislature, and we're going to pick them based upon population. How do we determine population? Census, right? We count people. Well, they wanted the African slaves to be counted. In the northern, it's like, wait a minute. They're either people, because they're going to count people, or their property. Make up your mind. Why don't you free them all? So this tension was really there. And there's a recognition now that the South would have walked away if we weren't going to count them for some purpose. So the North added in that they're also going to be subject to an excise tax. And the South recognized, okay, you can tax them as property, but we want them counted. The North said you can't count them as a full person, or this whole thing's going to fall apart. So the other compromise is the compromise called the 3/5 compromise. For every African in bondage, and I'm purposely not calling them African Americans because they weren't recognized as citizens until much later on, until after the Civil War. I'm not saying they shouldn't have been, but they weren't. They're going to count as 3/5 of a person, not because of their value and humanity or anything like that. It's just for purposes of head count for how many Congress members you'll be able to get to send to Washington, D.C., well, then Philadelphia. And so the 3/5 was a compromise. So every time you have 5 African slaves, you'd have 3 in the head count of the population. That's one major compromise when it comes to slavery. There's also a thing with the fugitive slave law that those states that are freed of slavery, the bondage of slavery, any African slave that escapes from a slave state would have to be returned, and you couldn't aid and abet basically anybody in the Underground Railroad. All those kinds of things were in the Constitution as well. But the other one that's kind of interesting, I always found interesting overtly, is it says that Congress, the federal government, can't take any action on banning the slave trade because there's a big push for that. And they knew there was 3 different, Great Britain's about to end the slave trade. There's a big Haitian slavery uprising where horrified many people, especially in the South where there were large slave populations. And the third was there was already a overabundance of slaves in the states of Maryland, Virginia, and South Carolina. And so there's a question about, do we really need the slave trade to go anymore, bringing in new slaves from foreign countries? But they didn't want it to end immediately. They didn't want like the first Congress to come together and say we're going to ban slavery effectively. They wanted a 20-year window. And so they said effective 1808 is only the time that Congress can ban the foreign slave trade. And that wasn't a problem because the fact is that the slave population was growing naturally by propagation here in the United States. The need for importation was not nearly as significant, especially by 1808. The other issue is that it wasn't very much enforced. After 1808, was there any more slave trade in the United States? You bet, lots of it. Very little enforcement. It didn't, it wasn't a constituency to answer to, and the slave trade still went on significantly. But the slave trade just became internal. Those states that didn't need the amount of slaves that they had, and this is where the term comes from, sold down the river. If you're going to go, somebody sold, they sold them down the river. That's a term related to the slave trade internally in the United States of America. It's a sad term. That's why when you hear terms like grandfathering, which you get to a later chapter, in terms like that, and sold down the river, they relate to the sad part of our history called slavery. Now, what's one of the things the Constitution didn't give? Certainly didn't give African Americans the right to vote. Certainly didn't give their freedom, even though some people initially talked about it. But it wasn't an overwhelming number of people going down there. They wanted to fix the government in an emergency situation. But whites didn't get the right to vote. And who was allowed to participate in our democracy? Even to that time, the states were reserving the right to determine eligibility to sit for most offices. Not the federal. The federal in the Constitution says it's mostly age. Have to be a citizen for 7 years to be a member of the United States Congress. You have to be a citizen for 9 years to be in the Senate, and you have to be a natural-born citizen to be the president of the United States. So all those criteria are put in the federal. But what about in terms of actually voting for people? Most states had very strict restrictions, not only probably on faith even still right up until that point. It was about to change, but faith requirements. But the bigger one is you had to be a white male, usually of a certain age, and often had to be fairly much have a stake in society, had to have wealth, had to have property. So we weren't very democratic. We get much better. So that's a big compromise. And then we get into Hamilton. Hamilton wins. I mean, in the end, he dies. We all die, but he died young. But his vision of the country was of a very urbane. The wealthy and the aristocrats of our nation would rule our nation, and the government should have its hand in the promotion and allegiance to economic viability in the thriving manufacture, export, and business of the nation. Jefferson didn't like that at all. Jefferson viewed our nation as being agrarian. Most of us be like gentlemen, and well, back then I'm thinking of the sexist language of that era, gentlemen farmers, that you participate in civic life, and the government be very, very small, very reserved, not spend a lot of money, be very, very almost invisible, let people run their own lives and not have large cities and not have a lot of commercial class people that dealt in making money from money. Jefferson found that repugnant. These two guys are going to be the competitors for America's vision for a period of time. And so the Constitution is created. What are we going to set up? We're going to set up a government. George Washington's the president, real stable guy. I don't know how exciting it was, but he was as a president, I mean, but very, very stable. But Hamilton recognizes we've got to pay off all those states' debts. We're going to create a lot more stability. Let's take over all the state debts, and then it will be a federal debt. And then to pay for the debt, we're going to start raising taxes. We're going to tax all kinds of things. We're going to put tariffs on corn and whiskey and agriculture and tariffs on trade, and we'll make the federal government very wealthy. Then we'll create a federal bank where we can lend money and invest money, and the economy will start booming. He was right. It worked. But initially, one of the things they like to talk about, and I love to talk about this question, is the Whiskey Rebellion out, I think it's Western Pennsylvania, came up to almost 7,000 troops at one time. The taxation on whiskey became so repugnant, and it was seen as two different worlds. Those that were Federalists, those that were like Hamilton, wanted urbane, commercial class, aristocrats running the country, and the country directly involved with financial underpinnings of our nation's economic system. Those guys were mostly where? In the city. They were mostly on the West Coast. The interior of our nation, the more agrarian type of the country, were what we call Republican Democrats, which was Jefferson. And there's the tension. This is the first two parties, really. We have the Federalists, which were part of the sponsors of promoting our centralized form of government. But then the anti-Federalists fade away right after the Constitution's adopted, but a new party comes up, what we call Jeffersonian Republicanism, sometimes called Republican Democrats. Kind of an oxymoron right there. It's not of what we think of today as the party. But those two guys are in big tension. Who's going to win Washington's ear? Hamilton does. Jefferson thinks creating a national bank, for example, is unconstitutional. Where does it say in the enumerated powers that we can create a national bank? It says we can coin money. It says we can raise an army, navy. We can raise military. We can raise taxes. We can regulate commerce. We can enter into foreign treaties. We can do all these different things. But nowhere does it say we can set up a federal bank to be responsible for the exchange of money and currency and be backing of that kind of system. Hamilton says it's absolutely essential that banks be part of the federal government, because in order to do taxes, in order to expend money, in order to fund infrastructure, banking is essential to it. And he harped on something called the necessary and proper clause. So when you read all the enumerated powers in the Constitution, that gives you kind of sort of core things that the government has the power to do. But then it leaves this last thing, sometimes called the elastic clause, saying in all things necessary and proper to effectuate those enumerated powers. Washington was on the fence, had a tough time with this one, but he goes along with Hamilton. And as a result, what does our nation become? Very commercial, very much having the federal government involved in the spurring and responsiveness to our economy's growth. And who does it favor? It does favor the wealthy. It does favor the commercial class. But it wasn't because Hamilton was saying that because it was an evil thing to do. He said that when the commercial class thrives, the entire nation thrives. And it's almost like a trickle-down theory. And his vision of the country definitely worked. You wonder where he would have went if he would ever became the president of the States if he wasn't killed by a guy by the name of Aaron Burr. And what else was going on at this time? So we got the Federalists and we got the Jefferson Republicans. Another new tension happens. Those that are in the Federalist Party that like the commercial interests are recognizing we're having a tough time not being able to trade with Great Britain anymore. There's still a lot of tension with Great Britain. The war's been over for a while, but there was a huge boon under the mercantilist system working with them. Hamilton and others said, hey, we got to start working again. Let's have a treaty so we can stop hostilities and start doing some trading. So they sent over John Jay, who was a good friend of Hamilton's. He was on the Supreme Court at the time. The Supreme Court didn't have such a big role at that moment. He goes over to Great Britain, comes up with what we call Jay's Treaty. Very unpopular with rural members of our society, very unpopular with Jefferson, because it opened up trade and commerce with Great Britain, basically kind of making them also an ally because they're still at war. France and England are still at war. The tension there is between these groups. So Hamilton's viewed as sort of a aristocratic ally of monarchy and of the crown. Jefferson looks like he's more of a libertine, liberal, small government, agrarian allegiance. And what happens right in this era? The French Revolution. Many people think after our revolution, the French military goes back home and spreads these ideas of representative democracy and overthrow the government. And at first, our entire nation celebrates the French Revolution. It's great. Get rid of the monarchy, power to the people. It's great. And those of you that ever studied the French Revolution know that it becomes horrific. I mean, there's this unbelievable purge they're having at the town, in downtown. They're chopping everybody's heads off. I mean, it's a bloodbath beyond bloodbaths. And what does it make many of the Americans see the revolution as? Initially, they're chanting for it, they're rooting for it, they love it. And then in a couple of years, what do they think about the French Revolution? They're horrified by it. So many people in government, the Federalists that are in government, guys like John Adams after Washington, the first real election, really not a contentious election, but John Adams is in there. He's a Federalist, although he doesn't get along very well with Hamilton because he's so prickly. But they don't get along. But the point is they're kind of aligning more now with the stability of Great Britain and the monarchy. And those that are more allied with the French are seen as radical. And look what they could possibly do to shake up the stability of our nation. What happens is something very, very sad in our history after the French Revolution really deteriorates into this really horrific bloodbath is, again, John Adams being a Federalist gets the Congress, because you can't pass a law. Everyone thinks presidents can pass a law on their own. Can't. You got to have Congress on board. So they pass something called the Alien and Sedition Act. The Alien Act is to basically expel any foreign person who may be agitating for revolution and or instability in our government. Most people actually were kind of in favor of it, but what was it aimed at? French. There was a very big fear here. You ever hear the term Illuminati, like this underground dark society trying to, I don't know, do what, but basically in that era to undo the government. And there was a real fear of French sort of intrigue in our nation. And so they created the Alien and Sedition Act. The Alien Act was to deport any of these basically French out of the country because they thought they were going to bring the French Revolution to us, something much more severe than what we experienced in our own revolution. I don't know if anybody, or if only a handful of people were actually removed from the country under the alien portion of that law. Most people did what? They saw the law coming. They might be French. They might be, they might think, oh, I'm going to be expelled from the country. You pack your bags, you leave. And many did. There was a huge amount of French nationals and others that left the country because of the passage of the Alien and Sedition Act. But the Sedition Act was much more troublesome. What did that say? Listen to the language. It said that speaking or publishing false, scandalous, and malicious writings against the government was unlawful. In fact, one congressman was complaining about something the Adams administration was doing. He was jailed for a period of time, and so were many newspaper people that were in the press, were publishing articles that were deemed to be detrimental to the standing and the integrity of the government. People were getting locked up. And so this is where the tension first started under our First Amendment of the United States Constitution. The First Amendment says, freedom of the press shall not be abridged, and nor shall freedom of speech. But the debate was, what does that mean? Any speech? And the argument was by the Federalists that speech can be punished if it's seditious, if it hurts the nation. And then there were people like Jefferson and Madison that said, speech is basically sacrosanct. You can't touch it, especially if it's in the press, and especially if it relates to criticism of the government. This is basically what the election of 1800 is really going to be about. The sedition, the Alien Sedition Act is huge. It really puts a split down our country in the viewpoint of what's happening. But you have to understand the underpinnings. One side looks like they're kind of getting cozy with the monarchy of Great Britain that we broke away from. They're wealthy, the stable, the conservative, and the other group who are, siding with the rebellious, bloodthirsty republicanism of the French Revolution. And so there's a real scary time in our country, a lot of tension going on. Adams is going to run against Thomas Jefferson. He thinks it's just Thomas Jefferson, but he's actually running against Aaron Burr too. Back then, the Electoral College was kind of screwed up, but I'll get to that in a second. So, but anyways, why we study history, which is one of the most fascinating things I think about in terms of historical context, was Jefferson and Madison were so upset that they went to their home jurisdictions of then Kentucky, which is a part of Virginia at the time. Kentucky and Virginia, they write something called the Kentucky and Virginia Resolves, basically saying that the Sedition Act is illegal, it's unconstitutional. And more importantly, it said that the states had the power to nullify a federal law if the states determine it to be unconstitutional. Somehow the states would have the power to determine the constitutional of an act. What does that sound like? It sounds an awful lot like the Civil War of 1860 when Southern states said the federal government, it's called the nullification crisis. Now, this was never anything more than a written petition, but it got a lot of fanfare, and people still talk about it to this day, that the undercurrents of state rights versus federal authority, the tension there leading up to the Civil War, has always been pretty much around since the birth of our nation. So you should know the Kentucky and Virginia resolves. And many Americans in that era had to argue what free speech meant. Anything to do without fear of prosecution, or you got to be careful what you say. And then religious freedom comes up. Most of us think this is good news, no matter how religious you are. You do believe that government should have a distinct role in secular business, and religion should be staying out of it in terms of having any kind of requirement of a state or government-sponsored religious dogma one over the other. It's not an absolute bar because we do have religious cultural history as part of our nation. But for the most part, there should be no religious standing. Massachusetts, ironically, is the last state to have a state-sponsored congregational church, the Puritan. That was up until 1833. Yeah, 1833 was the final state. Massachusetts finally got rid of the religious test for holding state office. But we know to this day, I've been in a few political positions in my life, and what's the first thing I say? I promised to hold up the town charter of the town of Sturbridge, and I swear under God. Isn't that sort of a religious sort of underpinning from our history? And you bet there was. But we know the first state that made it illegal, or basically made the separation of church and state legal, was Virginia. A lot of people, that's why back in history, a lot of people called like Thomas Jefferson an atheist and James Madison an atheist, because they were the ones that pushed through. And initially unsuccessful. They had a few runs at it before they got it passed. Where Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, finally, it looks like in 1785, that they took the religious standardization out of the Virginia state government, that you could be any faith you wanted to. Some did it in a staggered way, like they would remove that you didn't have to be a member of the Congregational Church or this church, but oftentimes you still had to be a Christian, and you just had to have certain values that were consistent with Christian principles, and that got wider and wider and wider until it finally became meaningless. But there was still a lot of discrimination against non-believers of any faith, but certainly against Jewish people, certainly against Muslims. Not that there was a great number of them in our country at that time, but nonetheless, it's something that we take a great deal of pride on. That it doesn't matter what your religion is, you can serve in a secular office without having fear of retribution or qualifications. But it took a while for us to get there. Now the election of 1800, really good story. I love this story. So Adams is probably going to like Lewis. He doesn't have a lot of friends. Very smart guy, brilliant. But the Alien and Sedition Act really threw him under the bus. The economy's kind of hurting. He's pretty unpopular, and he is a independent-minded guy. I'll give him credit. I like people like that. I don't call him a maverick. He wasn't quite that independent. But, he did his own thing. And if he disagreed with what the Federalists wanted, he wouldn't be afraid to shun the Federalist view. So who's the big Federalist at that time? Alexander Hamilton. So does Alexander Hamilton really fight to get to get John Adams reelected? No. Kind of the writing's on the wall. Looks like the Republicans are going to win this election. There's a lot of pushback because of the Alien and Sedition Act, and there was concern about the aristocratic powers becoming of the country of the wealthy, and there was some blowback. And so Thomas Jefferson wins the Electoral College. With whom? Aaron Burr. Back then he was really running for vice president, but they didn't have a slot under a constitution for vice president. You put your name in the hat, and usually whoever came in second, you got the vice president. Well, now they had to change it, and that's the 12th Amendment. I believe it's the 12th Amendment. 12th Amendment to the United States Constitution. Yeah, changed the principle that you run for the specific slot of vice president and it changed actually to party affiliation. The party chooses the candidates for the ticket, if you will. You can't run independent. You can't say, well, I'm running for president, and you're running for vice president, be from a different party and win. It's the team, it's the pairing of the two that win the election. But in that era, it was a tie between Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. And who decides it then? Well, it's right in our Constitution. It'll be cited by the House of Representatives. Who was in control of the House of Representatives with the Federalists? And so Thomas Jefferson is not a Federalist. Aaron Burr is, God knows what Aaron Burr is. Aaron Burr is whatever he needs to be at any given moment. Very interesting person in our history, mostly vilified. I find him interesting because he doesn't have an allegiance to anything except himself, and he's got an interesting history. We'll get to that a little later because he does some other things later on. But Aaron Burr won't give it up. He says, "I got to shut the presidency. I'm tired." So it tied. So it has to go to the House of Representatives, and again, it's Federalist, so they're not really sure. I think it went to 36 ballots until Thomas Jefferson's finally elected. Who gives him the election? I mean, who sways it? Ironically, who would seem to be his archenemy, Hamilton. Hamilton has a complete view different of how government should be run, how big it should be, what role it should play in the economy than Thomas Jefferson. But what's he doing? It's kind of like the friend of the enemy of my enemy is my friend on some level. And he hated Aaron Burr even worse. They fought in New York for quite a number of years in local politics and over many other business entities. They hated each other. So basically, Hamilton says to the members of the House of Representatives let's get Thomas Jefferson in because he's certainly a better choice than Aaron Burr, and Jefferson wins as president. And that starts the whole new era in our country. And what's beautiful about it, and this is beautiful, and it's in the news today. What happens? Is there a civil? Because a lot of people that were supporting the Federalists said, if these Republican Jacobites, the supporters of the French Revolution win, we're not going to let it happen. What actually happened? Peaceful transformation. John Adams peacefully turned over the realms of government to Thomas Jefferson. Some people call it the revolution within the revolution because it was so revolutionary that the party in power peacefully gave up. We didn't know because when Adams won the presidency, it wasn't really a contested election. This was the first true contested election where people were fearful, would the loser give up power? Ever since then, no matter how acrimonious the elections have been, no matter how close, what have we always had in the transition of power in this country since 1800? Peaceful recognition. The loser bitches and moans and complains and say, next time we'll get you. But that's usually all we do. We don't say, no, let's hold on to it. Or we lost, but let's go, up with nowadays with, assault weapons and things, and let's go take over the government. And the sad part about our nation right now, there's some talk that if certain parties win or lose, they're not necessarily going to either take or give up political power peacefully. That's kind of sad that you think after 1800, which seems like such a beautiful story, that the losers lost with a certain degree of, dignity and a recognition of the federal way in which we're going to transfer power under Constitution was recognized. Very, very big. And we have to talk just briefly, and I know I went really long. The federal government is going to do a couple of things, and one of them is a case is going to come. John Adams, I'd do it too if I were in power. If I got a couple of months left or a couple of weeks left, what am I going to do during a couple of weeks? I'm going to let all the people go in the federal penitentiaries if I have the power to do a pardon. I'm kidding. But would I try to appoint a lot of people that I thought were really good to be in federal roles while I still had the power to do so? Yeah. And Adams was no different. So Adams appoints a bunch of different people to the bench, to the judiciary, Federalists. Let's get as many Federalists in government before I get out. And so he appoints one guy by the name of Marbury. And Marbury, he gets his appointment from the president. The Secretary of State at that moment was John Marshall, but he never gets around signing it. The new president comes in, Thomas Jefferson. His new Secretary of State's James Madison. The old Secretary of State becomes the chief of the United States Supreme Court, John Marshall. So the guy sues, and he says, hey, I was duly given this judgeship by John Adams, but I need the certificate of approval from the Secretary of State, and Madison's refusing to give it to me. So he sues. And this is a beautiful part. John Marshall actually rules in favor of Thomas Jefferson, says, we don't have the power to we think you got screwed, basically. You think you do. Legally, you have the right to that job. But we don't have the power to grant you that position because the Judiciary Act of 1791 is unconstitutional. And now here's where the brilliance is. He says, so Thomas Jefferson, no worries, you don't have to give him the judgeship. But to make perfectly clear, we, the United States Supreme Court, can review statutes of the federal government, and then roughly 15, 20 years later, also of state governments and other actors, We can rule their behaviors, their laws, as unconstitutional and strike them down. That is the most important Supreme Court case that's ever been decided in history. Because what did it give the judiciary? It suddenly gave them steroids. They suddenly became a powerful third branch of government because it can shoot down what the president does as unconstitutional. It can shoot down what the legislature does as constitutional. So anytime the legislature is thinking about passing a law, they have to think, well, there's checks and balances. We've got to make sure both the Senate and the House agree. Now we got to worry about whether the president is going to veto it, right? And then now we have to worry about whether the court might rule it as unconstitutional. So sometimes laws say, why aren't more laws ruled as unconstitutional? Because the legislature is very cognizant of the fact that we got to make sure the laws jive with the mandates of the Constitution and the history of what the court has ruled in those cases. It's a huge deal. John Marshall should be on our radar as one of the great, and I'm not saying great in terms of good, but I'm saying in terms of significance and power. John Marshall in the court, he's a Federalist. He manages to basically create the third tier of government, the third branch of government is created because of the case of Marbury versus Madison, because it's been an accepted precedent ever since that any claim or controversy that comes into the courts have the power to saying you've done something unconstitutional, therefore it's null and void. Shocking. It was shocking to the framers then, and it was shocking to Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson went nuts. He was so mad. He wins the case, but he loses all this power. In fact, he would always criticize John Marshall later on, and we'll get to some other cases later that John Marshall does, completely inconsistent with what Thomas Jefferson wants, and it's a great tension between the two. And I believe they're second cousins, actually, too. They're both out of Virginia. But John Marshall is the great hero to those of us that like the fact that the judiciary can stop a president that's off the rails constitutionally, or a Congress that's acting illegally. It's a powerful, powerful tool, and it really is. And it does keep us free on some level. You think about it. If the legislature passes some law that is infringing upon my civil liberties, who do I go to seek protection? The court. And what can the court do if they say that law is saying you can't criticize the government's unconstitutional? It protects me. And if they say I'm wrong, well, at least I've had that opportunity to have a review done by an independent third branch of the government to ensure the integrity of our government's actions. Huge. But we're going to get to a bigger case in a later chapter, in that, not bigger, but a very big case, and that's over whether the National Bank is constitutional or not, because Thomas Jefferson hates the National Bank, and he says, there's nothing in the Constitution that says you have it. Marshall, being like Hamilton, a Federalist, says, yeah, but the bank is related to raising of taxes, expenditure money, coining of money. Banks are essential to that. So under the necessary and proper clause, you can. So what does John Marshall have besides creating the concept of judicial review? He also expands the understanding of what our Constitution means in terms of federal power. He expands it exponentially beyond what the written words suggest the federal government has for power. I know I went on and on and on, but it's a great chapter, a lot of good stuff. Hopefully I don't bore you to death.